Why you couldn't live a day in the Wild West morning comes too early. Let's start with the morning dot, not a heroic morning. Not the kind where golden rays of sunlight sweep across a canyon and a handsome cowboy lights a cigar before taming a wild. Stallion dot no. This is the real kind of morning you'd have in the American West. The kind that comes too early, too cold, and much too dry. You wake up in a one-room cabin, if you're lucky. One bed, if you built it. One blanket, if it hasn't been eaten by moths. And the mattress, if we can call it that, is mostly straw, burlap, and the memory of comfort. If you're not in a cabin, you're on the cold ground staring up at a flat sky that hasn't changed for hours. Outside, the wind whispers through brittle grass, carrying the smell of horse dung and old ash. Inside, it's not much better. The room smells like damp wood, wet wool, old sweat, and feet. You slept in your clothes. Everyone did. Undressing at night was a fine way to freeze or lose your boots to rodents. Or both. Your back aches before you even move. You've got a kink in your neck from sleeping wrong, and your feet are already sore, though they haven't hit the ground yet. There's a draft from somewhere. Probably the gap in the wall you meant to fix last spring, but didn't, because there was always something else to fix. The fence, the roof. Yourself, do you sit up slowly? Your joints sound like a saddle being cinched. There's a layer of dust on everything, your boots, your chest, the windowsill. You've stopped noticing. But it's there. You reach for your boots. They're stiff. Still damp from the morning dew 2 days ago, and they never really dried out. The laces are fraying, and there's a rock lodged deep in the sole that you've been meaning to dig out. You don't. Instead, you brace yourself and shove your foot and it feels like sliding your toes into a wood stove filled with thorns. But you grit your teeth. There's work to do. There's always work to do. You stand slowly, carefully, like a much older person than you actually are. Everyone in the West seemed older than they were. 30 looked like 50, and 50, well, you probably weren't around by then. The floorboards creak beneath you, not romantically, just loud enough to remind you the house isn't level. The nails are loose. There's a splinter under your heel you've been trying to ignore since last week. Out the window, a pale sun rises reluctantly over the plains. Not dramatic, just there. And it brings no real warmth. The kind of sun. That mostly reminds you that the day is starting whether you like it or not. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is waiting over the fire. Cold beans in a dented pot. The fire went out an hour ago and no one bothered to stoke it. You prod the embers with a stick. They hiss like they're tired too. You spoon a few cold beans into a tin bowl and take a bite. They're salty, metallic, the texture of regret. But they don't make your stomach turn, so that's something. You chew slowly, sleepily, trying not to think too much about what's in them. Or what I S in single quotes T dot next comes the coffee dot, or more precisely, a vaguely coffee-flavored hot water. You boiled yesterday's grounds again. Because fresh coffee means opening the precious tin, and the tin is only half full. And supply wagons are late. Again, probably stuck in the mud near Dead Man's Gulch. Or robbed. Or just slow dot so you sip what you can. It's bitter, weak, a little sour, but it's warm. And warmth in the West was currency. Even if it tastes like burnt rope, you stare into the cup and wonder if today is the day the mule gets out again. Or if the roof will hold through the afternoon wind. Or if that sore tooth of yours will stop throbbing on its own, or just get worse. Likely, just worse. You sigh. Not dramatically. Not with purpose. Just a slow exhale from a tired body that knows what's coming. The same thing as yesterday outside. The world is beige. Brown. Maybe, if you're lucky, a little pale green. Dust clings to the horizon like a distant memory. The grass is yellowed, stubborn, and crackles underfoot. The horses are stirring slow, lazy creatures with sad eyes and patchy hair. You love them, but they don't love you. Not really. You saddle up your mare. She grunts as you do. You grunt louder. The saddle creaks like a complaint. The leather is cracked. You haven't oiled it in weeks. You keep meaning to. But oil costs money. And time. And energy. And everything is just a little too hard out here. Your fingers are stiff from the cold. They fumble with the straps. The buckle sticks. Your thumbnail splits. You keep going. Eventually you mount. The horse shifts under you, unimpressed. The world doesn't change. You squint into the morning. The sun's a little higher now. The flies are awake. So is your neighbor's rooster 2 miles away, crowing faintly into the wind. He always crows late. Not that it matters. No one has anywhere urgent to be. Time here isn't measured by clocks. It's measured by chores, fence posts, shovels of dirt, how long it takes to boil beans, how many steps to the well, how long you can put off washing your shirt before someone says something. You ride slowly past the fence line. It's leaning again. The north post gave out during last week's wind. You'll fix it later. Maybe. The morning passes like syrup. Thick, slow, sticky with things to do, but none of them urgent enough to feel real. You are tired, still, but it doesn't feel like the kind of tired that goes away. It's deeper than that, more like background tired, a kind of hum under your skin that never turns off. The body learns how to move while exhausted. It learns to stop noticing the ache in your shoulders, the pull in your back, the scratch of coarse wool against your thighs. Sometimes you daydream about sleeping in, but you never do, because if you did, something important would break or wander off or die out by now. The sun is warm enough to feel, but not warm enough to enjoy. The heat brings sweat, and the sweat brings flies. Always the flies. They land on your face, your hands, your lips. You brush them away without thinking. You've stopped caring if people see you with fly bites. Everyone has them. Just like everyone has calluses and chapped lips and eyebrows that never grow back quite right after frostbite. The wild. West was not glamorous. It was not heroic. It was not wild. It was mostly ... tiring and dry. A place full of long silences and mild discomforts. Not big ones. Just endless small ones. 1,000 paper cuts of inconvenience . So you ride a little further, past the same rock, the same tree stump. You wonder briefly if today will be any different. It won't, and that's okay. Because different isn't always better out here. Different usually means trouble, or a broken axle, or someone coming down with the cough that never quite goes away. You shift in the saddle. Your thighs ache. Your boots are tight. You consider stopping, but there's no point. The work doesn't stop, not for thoughts, not for feelings, not for blisters. Eventually, the morning fades. The sun rises higher. The shadows shorten. The wind picks up. You think about lunch. Probably more beans, maybe bread, maybe not. You'll check when you get back. If the mice haven't chewed through the sack again, but that's a thought for later. Right now, it's just you. The horse, the dust, the saddle. And the soft, steady rhythm of another long, ordinary morning. In a place that was never meant to be romantic, just hard. Just dry. Just ... A little too early. Dirt. Just dirt everywhere. Let's talk about dirt. Not the dramatic kind, kicked up by galloping horses in a showdown at high noon. Not the movie kind, where dust adds flair to a slow motion scene. No, this was a quieter kind of dirt, persistent, ordinary, an uninvited companion that simply never left. You didn't see it as something to clean anymore. Not really. It was just part of the texture of life. When we say the West was dusty, we don't mean a fine powder you might brush from your coat. We mean a constant film of soil, ash, wind-blown grit that settled on your skin, your clothes, your bed, your food. You'd bathe if you could find water, and by the time you were dry, you already felt dirty again. Not in a dramatic, muddy sort of way, just a vague crustiness. A thin veil of the land itself, clinging to you like a second skin. It got in your teeth. That was maybe the worst of it, the sensation of chewing on something and feeling that familiar crunch between your molars. Not food, not bone, just dust. Dust that had floated through the air, settled on your bread, slipped into your canteen. You couldn't avoid it, you just chewed through it. People lost teeth early back then, not just because there were no dentists, but because everything, even your meals, wore you down. The air itself was dry and heavy, always carrying more particles than breath. You'd step outside and feel it on your eyes and your nostrils, behind your ears. When the wind picked up, it didn't howl, it rasped. A low, scratchy hiss of sand scraping across wood, across tin, across your face. You'd squint without thinking. Your eyes always stung a little, and wiping them only made it worse. Your hand was already dirty, too. Clothes didn't stay clean. After a few days, the fabric stiffened with salt, grit, and sweat. You could shake them out or beat them against the fence post, and clouds would rise up like smoke, but they never looked or felt fresh. Laundry was a rare, special effort, hauling water, scrubbing with homemade lye soap that burned your knuckles, wringing everything out by hand and waiting for it all to dry stiff and scratch you in the sun. After that much work, you almost didn't want to wear them again, but it didn't matter. Because the moment you pulled them on, the dust welcomed you back. It slipped into the seams, the cuffs, the lining. It didn't discriminate. If there was a surface, it settled on it. Even in your house, especially in your house, the dust made itself at home. Every windowsill had a film. Every shelf had a layer. The floor crunched underfoot unless you swept it daily, and even then you weren't so much removing it as just moving it around. There was no escape. Only surrender dot, and then there were the winds. Dry gusts that would blow for hours. Not violent enough to knock things down, just strong enough to wear you out. They came without warning and stayed as long as they liked. When the wind came, you tied a bandana over your face and squinted against the horizon, hoping it would pass before supper. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. The wind had its own plans. If you lived in a sod house, like many early settlers did, the dirt wasn't just around you. It was your house. Your walls were soil. Your roof was made of grass. Bugs lived in the ceiling, and dust fell on your face while you slept. A good rain could mean a muddy trickle down your chimney. A bad one could mean your roof caving in. But even if you lived in a wooden shack or a tent, the wind still found a way in. Through cracks, under doors, across thresholds, every crevice. Invited the dust inside dot children played in it. Animals rolled in it. Men tracked it across floors, and women swept it up in circles, knowing it would return before sundown. It was in the water if the well ran shallow. It coated the inside of your mouth. It clung to your eyelashes. It stained your fingernails. And no matter how many times you washed your hands, if you had enough water to wash them at all, they never felt truly clean that you stopped caring after a while. Not in a hopeless way, just in a practical one. You learned to live in a state of mild discomfort. You learned not to wipe your forehead too often because the grit made your skin. You stopped worrying about wiping your face altogether. Everyone looked the same, flushed, dusty, sun-pinked, and always just a little weathered. There was no vanity, no glamour. Just sun, wind, and earth dot. The soil wasn't rich, by the way. Most of the time, it wasn't even useful. It was dry, stubborn, and pale. The kind of land that refused to grow anything unless you coaxed it like a mule. And sometimes, even then, it would just spit out your seeds and blow them away. Farming in the West wasn't poetic. It was heartbreak with a shovel. The land didn't love you back. And when it rained, and sometimes, rarely, it did, the dust turned to mud. Thick, clinging mud that sucked at your boots and warped your wagon wheels. It wasn't a refreshing change. Just a wetter form of the same inconvenience. The moment the sun came out, it all dried back into a fine crust, ready to be kicked up. Again. Even sleeping didn't offer a reprieve. Your pillow had dust in it. Your blanket did too. And when you woke up, your mouth was always dry, not just thirsty, greedy. You'd wake with the taste of earth on your tongue and the feeling of having breathed in the road itself. Even the sunrise looked dusty, pale, blurred at the edges by the haze that never truly lifted. The truth is, the West wasn't all sunsets and wide open skies. It was dirt in your food, dirt in your socks, dirt under your fingernails and your ears and your prayers. It was never clean. It wasn't meant to be. And when you finally did wash, maybe once a week, maybe less, you'd look down at the basin afterward and realize that water, that brown cloudy swirl, wasn't just dirt. It was part of you, what you'd become. And what you'd still be tomorrow. You didn't conquer the land. Out there, it settled into you, quietly, slowly, one dusty breath at a time. Your bathroom is a hole in the ground. There are a few things you take for granted until they're gone. A clean glass of water, a bed with springs, a locked door, and perhaps most of all, a toilet, a modern bathroom. Warm, private, reliable. Porcelain, plumbing, a place to sit where the seat isn't made of splintered wood and a wasp's nest doesn't threaten you from the rafters. But in the Wild West, your bathroom wasn't a bathroom. It was well. It was a hole in the ground. Maybe with a wooden frame built around it if someone had the time and lumber. Maybe with a door that hung straight, or maybe not. But either way, it was just a place you trudged out to. Morning, noon or night, squinting into the sun or fumbling in the dark, hoping you didn't step on something alive. Or worse, something dead. The outhouse was never close. For reasons both sanitary and olfactory. You didn't build it next to your house. You kept it a decent walk away, which meant that every visit to the toilet began with a small journey. Across brittle grass, over uneven ground, through mud in spring and crusted frost in winter. If it was raining, the path turned slick. If it was dark, you carried a lantern, one hand steady on the handle, the other reaching out into the gloom, brushing aside spider webs, and hoping you didn't startle anything with teeth. There was no light inside, just a hole in a wooden bench, and below it, darkness. You didn't look too long. There were things down there. The smell alone discouraged curiosity. A deep, earthy rot mixed with ammonia and thyme. Sweet and sharp in the way of something tooled to fix. It clung to your clothes. Sometimes it clung to your dreams. The wooden seat was cold in the morning. Not just cool, cold. The kind that made you question your choices. That slapped your skin and reminded you, quite vividly, that life in the West was not meant to be comfortable. And in summer, the heat turned everything inside the outhouse into a slow-cooked stew of smells. The air hung thick. The flies were more numerous. The wood sweated resin, and the wasps returned. Always the wasps. Nesting in the corners, buzzing lazily, just waiting for someone to make the wrong move. Privacy? That wasn't really part of the deal. The walls didn't always reach high enough, and the door rarely had a latch that worked. If you were in a town, the outhouses might be arranged in a row behind the saloon or general store, separated by a few boards and a shared sense of mutual embarrassment. If you were on your own land, you had the illusion of solitude, but only until your neighbor rode past or your child burst in asking where the wash basin had gone. You learned to be fast. Or you learned not to care. Toilet paper didn't exist. Not the soft, white, perforated kind. Anyway, you used whatever was available, usually rough scraps of newspaper. Pages torn from a catalog or dried corn cobs. Yes, corn cobs, sometimes grass, if it had rained recently. Sometimes leaves, if you were willing to gamble. But you didn't ask questions. You just did what needed doing and hoped you didn't pick anything, poisonous. There was no hand washing station. No pump or soap waiting nearby. If you were lucky, there might be a bucket and a rag nailed to a post. But mostly you wiped your hands on your pants or your apron. Or, well, nothing at all. Germs weren't understood yet. And even if they had been, most folks had bigger problems. Hygiene was for people with time and extra water. And out here, you had neither. Outhouses filled up. That's something people don't think about. But they did. Slowly, surely. A hole only goes so deep. And when it reached the top, you had two choices. dig another one, or shovel out the old one. Most folks chose to dig, the unlucky ones chose to shovel, and for those with no land left to dig on, well, let's just say the air around. The homestead stayed heavy for a while. Winter was a special kind of misery. Ice on the seat, frost on the boards. Your breath puffed out in clouds while you tried to finish your business quickly before your fingers froze to the handle of the door or your thighs went numb. In those months, many preferred a chamber pot indoors, a metal bucket kept under the bed or tucked into a corner. It was slightly warmer, slightly closer, but came with its own share of unpleasant consequences. Mainly, someone had to carry it out in the morning and empty it and rinse it. Or more likely not, there was no dignity in the outhouse, no peace, no real comfort, just necessity. You went because you had to. You came back because you couldn't stand being in there any longer. And still, it was part of life. Everyone had one. Everyone used one. It was just another routine discomfort, folded into the long list of daily indignities. You didn't complain. There was no one to complain to. Just the wind. And the flies. And the worst part? It was dangerous. You wouldn't think so, but it was. Outhouses collapsed. Snakes curled up inside them. Spiders dropped down from the beams. One wrong step, one loose board, and you could fall into the pit itself. There are old stories. Not dramatic ones, not famous ones, just whispered recollections of people who didn't come back from the outhouse. A broken leg, a hidden illness, a fall no one heard. Out there, every errand was a gamble. But still, every morning, every evening, you made the walk, lantern in hand, breath shallow, boots crunching on dry earth, because it was the only option. Because even the smallest things in the Wild West required effort and discomfort. And the willingness to walk half asleep across your yard to sit in a shack full of spiders and ammonia. And do what needed doing. There was no plumbing. No privacy. No pause. Just a hole in the ground. And a sky full of indifference above you. Shoes were a nightmare of all the things you might take for granted in the modern world. Microwaves. Toothbrushes. Thermostats. There's one small luxury that rarely gets its due. A comfortable pair of shoes. Not flashy, not fashionable. Just comfortable. The kind you can slip on without thinking. The kind that fits. The kind that doesn't punish you for having feet. In the Wild West, that kind of shoe didn't really exist. What you had were boots. And what they were was awful. They were stiff, heavy, often handmade by someone who didn't quite know your foot and didn't much care. You couldn't walk into a store and choose your size. You took what was there, sometimes too big, sometimes far too small. And when you got a new pair, breaking them in wasn't a gentle process. It was weeks, sometimes months, of limping, blistering, and muttering under your breath every time your heel caught wrong or your toes cramped up against the hard leather tip. Most boots were made from cowhide, thick and unforgiving. The kind of leather that only softened after years of sweat and weather and wear. At first, it didn't bend, it creaked. It resisted you. Dug into your ankles, bit into the backs of your calves, rubbed red lines into your skin until the calluses caught up. There were no cushioned soles, no memory foam, no orthopedic inserts, just rawhide and hope. Maybe some straw, maybe a bit of old wool, if you could spare it. Stuffed into the toes to make up for the half-size gap that kept your foot sliding forward on every hill. Socks didn't help. If you had them, and not everyone did, they were usually thick. Wool, scratchy, and prone to bunching. They didn't wick away sweat or keep your feet particularly dry. They just softened the blow, slightly, until they got wet, which they often did. From rain or snow, or from trudging through morning grass that clung to you like dew-soaked knives. Wet socks meant cold toes, and cold toes meant numbness. And numbness meant you wouldn't notice the blisters forming until it was too late. And then there was solace, worn thin far too quickly, nailed together often unevenly. You'd step down and feel the uneven press of a crook tack under your heel, or the cold seep of moisture through a crack that had widened just enough to matter. You could try patching them, but leather was expensive, nails rusted, and glue wasn't always reliable, especially after weeks of walking through dust, mud, and whatever else the road threw at you. A good pair of boots was a point of pride. But even the best boots hurt you before they helped you. The act of putting them on each morning was its own quiet ordeal. You didn't slide into them. You shoved, sometimes with both hands. Sometimes with your boot jack wedged under your heel, bracing against the wall while you groaned and cursed under your breath. And if the boot had been wet the night before, and you hadn't stuffed it with rags, you'd find it warped and cold, curled like a sleeping animal that refused to stretch. Your foot would enter reluctantly, met with a damp chill and a distinct smell of old leather, sweat, and something vaguely fungal. Taking them off wasn't much easier. Your ankles would be swollen from the day's labor, your arches sore, your toes cramped. You'd sit down heavily, tug at the boot until it gave, often with a pop or a sigh, revealing a sock that had twisted itself into something unrecognizable. And sometimes when you finally peeled everything off, you'd find a raw spot, a bloodied heel. A blister popped and dried without notice. And you'd stare at it, shrug slightly, and go to sleep anyway. Because what else could you do? You couldn't afford to be precious about your feet. There were animals to tend to, fences to mend, fields to cross. You walked everywhere. Horses were expensive and wagons were slow, so most of your travel happened on foot, miles a day, in boots that weren't made for comfort, weren't shaped for your stride, weren't built to forgive the roughness of the land. Every step, a quiet negotiation with gravity and grit dot in winter. The boots froze. You had to keep them near the fire, propped just close enough to soften, but not so close they'd crack. If you forgot, or if the fire died, you'd wake to solid shoes, stiff with frost, as rigid as wooden blocks. You could beat them against the floor to loosen them, or hold them in your hands and breathe warm air into them, like a ritual. Either way, you weren't going anywhere fast. And in summer, the leather burned, soaked in the heat of the sun, scalding your soles from the bottom up. You'd feel it in your arches first, that dry, throbbing pulse of heat rising from the earth into your bones dot. And then there were the nails. The ones that stuck out from the inside. The ones that rubbed against your pinky toe like a persistent grudge. Or the ones that gave way entirely, letting the sole flap loosely with each step. You'd tie them shut with string or wrap them in cloth. Temporary fixes. Nothing lasted long out here. You might go months, even years, with the same pair, not because they were good, but because they were all you had. And when they finally gave out completely, when the heel split or the leather cracked beyond repair, you'd sit in the evening light and try to fix them by candle glow, stitching new pieces into old seams, re-soling by hand, bending old iron, nails into place with fingers too sore for fine work. And when you couldn't fix them anymore, you'd wear them anyway. Until your feet bled, until they blistered, until you just got used to it, thought there was no such thing as the right fit. Just a tolerable one, thought no such thing as breaking them in without also breaking yourself a little. They were shoes in name only. And still, you wore them. Because there was no other choice. Because even bad boots were better than no boots at. You're always a little bit hungry in the Wild West. Hunger wasn't always dramatic. It wasn't a sudden, desperate emptiness. It was slower than that, quieter, a constant dull ache that lived under your ribs and just stayed there. Not screaming, not crying, just tugging. A reminder every few hours that you hadn't quite eaten enough, that you were going after work anyway, that there was nothing else coming. Food was hard to come by, and even harder to keep. The land didn't give easily. Farming in the West was a game of patience and failure. Too dry, too windy, too unpredictable. Crops wilted in the sun or froze. Overnight, animals got sick. And even when things did grow, they grew slowly, grudgingly, not in abundance, just enough. Just barely. and then the grasshoppers came. Or the frost. Or the wind knocked it all flat, and you'd start again. Because you had to dot, so meals became rituals of necessity, not pleasure, not variety. Breakfast might be a slab of bread you baked days ago, now hard and dense as fencewood. Maybe a few spoonfuls of beans, cold from the tin. Coffee if you had it, though it was more like brown water boiled from old grounds, used 3, maybe 4 times. You sipped it anyway, not because it was good, but because it gave your hands something warm to hold. Lunch was often the same. Bread, maybe jerky. The kind of jerky that made your jaw ache, made your gums bleed, but still somehow wasn't enough to fill you. Meat, when you had it, was tough, stringy. You didn't eat fresh meat often. Not because you didn't want to, but because fresh meat didn't last. You had to salt it, dry it, smoke it. And by the time you did, it didn't taste like meat anymore. It tasted like salt, mostly salt and effort. You chewed until your mouth was tired. And then you went back to work. Hunting wasn't glamorous either. Not the way books and films suggest. It was long, boring, mostly walking, sometimes crawling, sometimes sitting still for hours and going home empty-handed. And when you did manage to bring something down, you had to skin it, gut it, clean it. There was no celebration, just more labor. And sometimes when the meat was bad, too old, too lean, too bruised, you had to throw half of it away, or eat it anyway. And hope fresh produce was rare. In towns, if you were lucky, a shipment might come in once a month. Apples, maybe. Onions, they'd be bruised and soft by the time they arrived. You paid too much for them, you ate them too fast. And then you waited again. On farms, you grew what you could, but it was never much. Potatoes, maybe cabbage. Root, vegetables that didn't mind bad soil. But the bugs liked them too, and so did the deer. You'd wake up one morning to find the garden trampled, everything half-eaten, and you curse into the wind, not with fury, just with tiredness. The kind that comes from watching something you've worked for vanish without apology. You couldn't store much. You didn't have refrigeration, a cellar if you were lucky, a cool spot under the house maybe. You salted things, pickled things, buried them in jars, covered them in cloth and hoped the mice stayed out. But the mice never really did. They were everywhere, so were the flies. And you learned to check every meal for tiny footprints, chew marks, larvae. You scraped them off, cut around them, ate what you could. Because waste wasn't an option. Your stomach got used to being ignored. It adjusted to scarcity. It shrank, then complained less, then shrank again. And yet the hunger never went away entirely. Even after a meal, you'd feel it, that hollow edge, that subtle emptiness that followed you like a shadow. You went to bed with it, woke up with it, worked with it. It lived inside you like dust in your lungs. Not dangerous, but always there. Sometimes you dream about food. Not lavish feasts, just enough. A warm biscuit with butter. A full bowl of stew with meat that melted in your mouth. Coffee with cream. A peach, soft and ripe and dripping down your chin. You wake up and taste none of it. Just the cold dryness of morning and the stale bread waiting on the shelf. If you had bad teeth, and most people did, eating hurt, chewing became a gamble. Some people lost so many teeth they started swallowing soft food whole. Others lived on soup, if they had the fuel to boil it. But even soup got old. Watered down, bland, the same ingredients over and over until your taste buds gave up. But you didn't stop eating. You just stopped expecting it to be good. You couldn't afford pickiness. You couldn't afford allergies. You couldn't afford cravings. You ate what was there. What was left. What hadn't spoiled. What hadn't been nibbled by something smaller than you dot, and on the rare days when there was something good. When the neighbor brought over a pie. Or a trader offered fresh cheese. Or a holiday gave reason to roast a chicken. It felt like a gift. Like grace. Like something fragile you didn't quite trust. You savored it slowly, and you didn't speak while you ate. Because good food wasn't a pleasure. It was a miracle. And it never lasted long. Travel was just walking forever. The West, travel was not adventure. It was not the start of a grand tale or the heart of some noble quest. It was not galloping across an open prairie with a rifle on your back and the wind in your hair. No, travel, real travel, was walking. Relentless, repetitive, foot cramping walking. The kind of walking that didn't feel like going somewhere, just moving through space, one sore step at a time, with the same view ahead of you for miles and the same ache in your calves that never went away. The truth is, very few people rode horses. Horses were expensive. Horses got injured. They needed to eat, to rest, to be shod and fed and brushed and calmed. You didn't just ride one off into the sunset. You fed it oats you couldn't afford and worried every day that it might go lame or throw a shoe or simply vanish in the night. Most folks didn't own a horse. If you were lucky, you had a mule or an ox. If you were very lucky, you had two and a wagon to put behind them. But even that wasn't the dream people imagined. Wagons were not graceful things. They groaned and rattled and shuddered over every bump, and the ride inside was less a ride than a mild. All-day concussion? If you ever sat in the back of a wagon, you'd remember it. The wheels caught every stone, every rut in the dirt, and sent the shock straight up your spine. There were no seats, no padding. Just wooden boards and maybe a sack of flour to lean against if no one needed it. You'd hang on as best you could, bracing yourself against the sides, trying not to fall out. It was loud. It was slow. It was constant discomfort, and yet somehow still preferable to walking, if only just. But for most people, travel happened on foot. You walked to town. You walked to church. You walked to your neighbor's place, which might be 5 miles away and still counted as just down the road. You walked beside the wagon because it was too heavy to carry both you and the supplies. You walked through mud that pulled at your boots like it wanted to eat them. Through dust that clung to your eyelashes and turned every breath into a dry cough. Through grass that hid snakes and ticks and everything you didn't want to think about. And the distance? The distance was always more than you thought. Always you'd ask someone how far to the next town and they'd say, not far. Which meant a half day, maybe more. Just over the ridge could mean another 10 miles. A short walk was a lie people told each other because the truth was too heavy to speak out loud. The land stretched forever, indifferent to your feet. You could walk all day and the horizon wouldn't move. Just sky and dirt and the sound of your own steps. And maybe the low creak of leather and the quiet drag of fatigue behind your eyes. There were no signs, no maps worth trusting. You followed trails that were barely trails, carved into the grass by wagon wheels and hope. You looked for trees shaped a certain way or rocks someone had stacked or fences that hinted at nearby farms. If it rained, the road vanished into mud. If it snowed, it disappeared entirely. And if you got lost, well, you just kept walking. Sometimes someone found you. Sometimes they DID single quotes T-dot weather made it worse. Of course. In summer, the sun bore down with a kind of slow cruelty. There was no shade, no canopy of trees. Just the occasional twisted cottonwood or a rocky outcrop too small to matter. You'd sweat through your clothes by noon, and by afternoon they'd be crusted with salt, clinging to your skin like damp burlap. The solace of your boots burned from. The heat of the road, your lips cracked, your skin peeled. And still you walked. Because there was nowhere to stop. In winter, it was a different kind of misery. The air was sharp and bitter, stinging your cheeks and making your breath feel like smoke in your throat. Your fingers stiffened on the reins, or the walking stick, or the ragged map you couldn't really read. You'd wrap scarves around your face until you couldn't see, and still the cold found a way in. It crept down your collar, up your sleeves, into your bones. Travel didn't pause in the cold, it just slowed. And every mile took twice as long. Sometimes you shared the road with others. Traders, drifters, families heading west with wagons full of furniture they'd eventually abandon. You'd nod as you passed, maybe share a meal or a fire, maybe not. You didn't talk much while traveling. The road was long and you needed your breath for walking. When night came, you didn't stop because it was safe. You stopped because you were too tired to keep going. You'd find a flat patch of land, tie up your animal, unroll a thin blanket, and sleep with your boots still on. The stars stretched above you, cold and unsympathetic. The ground was hard. Your legs twitched in your sleep from walking too far on too little food. In the morning, you got up and did it all again. There was no thrill in it, no romance, just distance, a slow erosion of will. Each footstep a quiet negotiation between the place you were and the place you hoped was waiting. But most of the time, when you finally arrived, the destination wasn't worth the effort. A town with a few buildings and no shade. A homestead barely standing. A neighbor who wasn't home. A dry well. A fence post. A vague sense that maybe if you walked a little farther, it would be different that it really was. Everyone smelled bad. Always. There's something we don't talk about when we romanticize the past. Something we leave out when we picture the prairie, or the saloon, or a noble cowboy riding off into the golden dust of early evening. It's not the boots, or the hunger, or even the loneliness. It's the smell. Because the West smelled bad, deeply, universally. Always, it clung to people like a second skin, soaked into clothes, hair, furniture, and breath. It wasn't one thing, and it wasn't shocking. It was simply everywhere. A quiet, sour truth that wrapped itself around daily life and never left. Most people didn't bathe regularly. Water was scarce. Heating it took time, and bathing itself, even if you had a tub, meant filling it by hand, one bucket at a time, from a pump or a stream or a well. Then you sat in it, usually in the same water as your spouse, your child, or your housemate, depending on the order and the day. You used lye soap, which was harsh and stung your skin, and when you were done, you dried off with whatever cloth wasn't already stiff from last week's wash. It was an ordeal, so most people skipped it, or put it off, or convinced themselves they didn't need it quite yet, and the result wasn't filth in the dramatic sense. It was more residue. The slow accumulation of skin, sweat, smoke, wool, leather, and food. You wore the same shirt for days. The same socks until they went stiff. Underwear, if you had it, was rarely washed more than once a week, if that. Over time, your clothes took on a texture and a scent that no amount of airing out could fix. They just became you. Every wrinkle, every patch of faded fabric held its own story and its own funk. The human body, left to its own chemistry, creates an aroma, not repulsive, not necessarily overwhelming, but strong and layered. And back then, it mixed with every part of your day. Sweat from the morning's work, smoke from the cook fire, grease from dinner, leather from the saddle, a hint of horse, a bit of iron from the blood you couldn't quite scrub off your knuckles. If you were a woman, it might include the sour metallic tang of menstrual cloths that were rinsed and reused until the fabric wore thin. If you were a man, maybe the scent of pipe smoke clung to your beard and your breath. If you were a child, you simply smelled like dirt and sugar and whatever animal you last tried to pet. No one noticed the smell much. Not because it wasn't there, but because everyone had it. It was a shared condition, an ambient reality. You might notice someone who smelled worse than usual, a stranger with rotten teeth or a shirt, gone green in the folds, but not the average person. Because the average person simply smelled human, unwashed, real, like old wool in a hot attic, like meat that's almost spoiled, like leather and lard and armpit, and maybe a bit of manure depending on how close you lived to the barn. Existed, but it wasn't used the way we think of it now. It was harsh, medicinal, and expensive. Sometimes people dabbed it behind the ears to cut the edge of a particularly rough afternoon. More often, it was saved for funerals, or diluted into rosewater and sprayed on linens to make sleep feel cleaner than it was. Some women carried little pouches of herbs, lavender, maybe, or mint, and pressed them to their noses in church when the crowd grew ripe. But mostly you just got used to it, even the worst of it. The deep foot rot, the mold in your boots, the oil in your hair, all of it settled around you like fog. Teeth, too, had a scent. Few people brushed. Fewer still flossed. a word that hadn't even been invented yet. Toothpaste, if you had it, was gritty and bitter. You could scrape your teeth with charcoal or rub them with a rag dipped in vinegar, but none of it helped with cavities or rot or the sour musk of a long untreated abscess. Some people chewed herbs to freshen their breath. Others swished whiskey. Most did nothing. Kisses, when they happened, were brief and practical. And then there were the animals. Horses, chickens, goats, dogs. They lived close, often closer than other humans. You mucked their stalls, shoveled their droppings, brushed their fur when you remembered. But the scent of them, damp hide, warm hay, ammonia-soaked bedding, sank into your clothes and followed you, mixed with your own scent until it became hard to know where one ended and the other began. Body odor wasn't a failure. It wasn't shameful. It just was. You smelled bad. Your neighbor smelled bad. The preacher smelled bad. Even the school teacher, with the pressed collar and the delicate shoes, she smelled bad too. Maybe of chalk and sweat and boiled starch. But bad nonetheless. And at the end of the day, you stripped off your outer layer, not to clean yourself, but to let your skin breathe before bed. You scratched the places that had itched all afternoon. You rubbed the spots where your clothes had chafed. And then you crawled into a bed that smelled just like you, maybe a little worse. You pulled a blanket over your nose and breathed it in, your smell, your home, your life, and you slept because you were tired, because the stink of things never kept you awake. Only the silence did. Bugs, rodents, and worse, there are few things so unglamorous as sleeping in the West. Not because of the cold or the rough blankets or the stiff backs, though all of those were there every night. But because the moment you closed your eyes and let your body soften into the silence, something small usually crawled across your skin. A tickle on your cheek, a flutter near your lips, maybe the sharp pinch of a flea making itself at home in the creases of your shirt. You could swat or shift or mutter into the darkness, but it rarely helped. They were already in the blankets, in the seams of your clothes, in the cracks of the floor. You shared your bed with a whole quiet world of things that didn't sleep when you did. Flies were everywhere. You could wave them off your face for a while, maybe during lunch, or when you were reading by the window, or trying to drink your morning coffee without swallowing one. But mostly they won. They gathered in the corners of rooms and danced, drunkenly in the air, landing on your food, your hands, your eyelids. They didn't care if you were clean or tired or praying. They just wanted what you had. Sweat, sugar, skin. In the summer, they bred in the manure piles and outhouses, in puddles gone sour from use, in leftover stews scraped into the dirt. You got used to chewing with your mouth closed, not because of manners, but because the less space you gave a fly, the better. At night, it was the mosquitoes that took over. They came in slow waves, thin and high-pitched, the sound of their wings like a thread pulled tight in your ear. They bit wherever the blankets didn't reach. Ankles, neck, the soft undersides of arms. And there was no such thing as insect repellent. Some folks burned cow chips to drive them away. The smoke worked, but the smell stuck to everything. Others smeared grease on their arms or wore damp rags over their faces. You could try to sleep under a net if you were lucky enough to own one, but most of the time you simply accepted it. Welts would bloom along your skin by morning. You'd scratch without thinking. And then move on. Then there were the fleas. Tiny, relentless, carried in by dogs. Rats, wild animals, and travelers who didn't know or couldn't admit they were infested. They lived in beds, in blankets, in your socks, in the hems of dresses, and the lining of hats. You'd wake up scratching, go to sleep scratching. Sometimes you'd find one hopping across your arm in the middle of dinner, smug and invincible. You could boil your clothes if you had the fuel, but more often you just shook them out and prayed for a cold snap to slow things down. Mice were inevitable. They crept through walls and ceilings, chewed through flour sacks and blankets, and nested in places that once felt like home. Drawers, boots, stovepipes. You could hear them at night, rustling under the floorboards or squeaking from inside the walls. Traps were few and crude, mostly improvised from whatever was lying around. Poison was dangerous and expensive. Cats helped if you had one, but they brought their own brand of trouble. Fleas, for starters, and a tendency to leave you gifts in your shoes. And then there were the rats. Bigger, bolder, less afraid of humans. They made homes in barns, under porches, behind pantries. Some were just nuisances, stealing food, knocking things over in the dark, but others were real threats. They could bite. They carried disease. And when they multiplied, as they often did, they didn't stay hidden. You might wake to find one staring at you from a shelf, or feel the weight of one skittering across the covers in search of crumbs. If that sounds like something from a nightmare, well, it was. But in the West, it was also Tuesday. Snakes found their way into places too. Not often, but often enough to make you cautious. You learn to shake your boots before putting them on, not out of paranoia, but because more than a few people had slipped a foot into leather and come away screaming. Small snakes, sleepy ones, but still full of teeth. They liked warmth, darkness, quiet, which meant they liked cabins, bedrolls, saddlebags, outhouses too sometimes. There's a kind of stillness you learn after enough encounters, a way of moving slow and checking corners before sitting down. It stays with you. Spiders were harder to notice. They tucked themselves into rafters and raffia, built webs between tools, inside water buckets, under bed frames. Some were harmless. Some weren't. Either way, you didn't touch them unless you had to. Bites weren't always deadly, but they were unpleasant, swelling, aching, sometimes refusing to heal. You learned to inspect the house seat, the curtain folds, the underside of your coat, just in case dot, and then, of course, there were lice. Not the schoolyard kind you hear about today, but the real, persistent kind. They lived in hair and seams, eyebrows, and shirt collars. They spread through shared blankets, crowded rooms, and secondhand hats. They were hard to see, harder to kill. You could comb, or shave, or douse yourself in vinegar, but they always came back. Everyone had them at some point. Some people just stopped trying. There was no such thing as a sealed house. No such thing as pest control. There were brooms, boots, buckets, and prayers. Sometimes traps. Sometimes just a well-aimed boot. But mostly you lived alongside them, the bugs, the rodents, the things with too many legs or not quite enough. You shared your food. Your floor, your sleep thought they were not visitors. They were neighbors. Illness came. Quietly and stayed too long. Illness in the West didn't arrive with a bang. There were no warnings, no weather alerts, no charts on the wall or blinking thermometers. It came. Slowly, quietly, like a weight pressing gently on your chest. You might not notice it at first, just a tiredness. A headache that stayed through supper. A throat that felt a little raw, like you'd swallowed dust, which, of course, you had. You go to bed early. Hope to sleep it off, but by morning it was worse. And there was nothing you could do except carry on. Chop wood, milk the goat, boil water. Sit up too fast and feel your head throb like a second heart. People got sick all the time. And it didn't mean panic. Not right away. Just part of the rhythm. A bad cough in winter. An upset stomach from spoiled stew. A rash from some plant you brushed against out back. But sickness back then had a different quality. It was slower, heavier, harder to shake. It didn't come and go in a weekend. It lingered, settled into the bones. Sometimes you got better. Sometimes you didn't, and either way, you still had to finish your chores. There were no antibiotics, no pharmacies, no friendly bottles with dosage instructions. You might have a few home remedies on hand, willow bark for pain, vinegar for cleaning wounds, whiskey for almost everything else. But that was it. If you were lucky, someone nearby had a book, a tattered volume on herbal cures, passed down through hands and guesses. It might say to boil sage, or rub turpentine on your chest. Or slice an onion and leave it by your bed, and you try, because doing something always felt better than doing nothing. Toothaches were their own kind of misery. Small at first, a dull ache in the back of your mouth, then sharper, then constant, and then it spread up into your temple, down into your jaw. You couldn't sleep, couldn't chew, couldn't think, really. And the only cure, when it got bad enough, was removal. No numbing, no hygienic setting. Just someone with strong hands and a set of iron tools, prying the problem out while you gripped the chair and tried not to scream too loud. People died of dental infections more than anyone likes to remember. A bad tooth could turn into blood, poisoning in a matter of days. And there was no one to stop it. Fever was always a concern. It was less about what it meant and more about how long it stayed. You could sweat through your clothes, toss off the covers, soak a rag in cold water, and press it to your head. But if the fever didn't break after a few nights, if it lingered, dry and burning, turning your dreams to static, people began to worry. There was little to do but wait, and keep the fire low, and try to coax broth down between chattering teeth. Coughs were common. They'd start after a long day in the wind, or a week sleeping on cold ground, or just because they could be dry or wet or thick with something you couldn't quite spit up. A cough could last the entire season. Some people never stopped. They'd bark through meals, through church, through conversations on the porch. You learn to live with it, your own or someone else's. The old ones coughed most, then the children. And when it got quiet, when someone who used to cough stopped, that was the real reason to worry. Infection was almost always lurking. A cut from, a fence post, a blister from your boots, a burn from a stove. These were daily things, small, forgettable injuries. But they festered, swelled, reddened, spread heat that made your whole arm throb. If you didn't drain it or clean it right, and few knew how to do either, it could kill you, slowly or quickly. But painfully, always, doctors existed. Yes, but they were far away, or expensive, or worse, inexperienced. Some had real knowledge. Others had bottles of snake oil and a gift for dramatic claims. You never knew what you were getting until it was too late. Sometimes you walked all day to see one. Sometimes you sent for them by horse. Sometimes they showed up drunk. But they still held the title, and when someone you loved was fading, you didn't ask too many questions, and it wasn't just the body that ached. Illness of the mind existed too, though it had no name. Not really. A deep sadness, a restlessness, a silence that grew thicker each day. Some people called it melancholy. Others didn't speak of it at all. You might see someone stop singing, stop smiling, start sleeping too much or not at all. The community would notice, then forget. Then remember again when the well hadn't been drawn in 3 days, or the animals hadn't been fed. People didn't understand it, so they blamed it on the weather, on bad luck, on spirits. Children got sick often, and they didn't always get better. A small cough could become pneumonia. A rash could be smallpox. A stomach ache could end in quiet stillness by morning. Parents didn't speak of it much. They couldn't, not while the others still needed feeding, still needed boots and water and firewood. So they worked with hollow eyes and buried the sorrow deep. Alongside the tiny shoes, there was no such thing as a clean bill of health. Just better than yesterday. Less pain than last week. You didn't ask how someone was doing, not really. You just looked at them, saw how they walked, how they breathed, how many blankets they needed. And if someone died, that was part of it too. Not unexpected. Not unusual. Just sad, quietly, briefly. Then life went on. Because it had to, lawlessness was mostly just confusion. If you've grown up with stories of the Wild West, you've probably heard of lawlessness. Gunslingers, bandits, posse chases, shootouts in the dusty street. But the truth is, it wasn't so much lawless as it was disorganized, unclear, patchy at best, and deeply mundane. Most towns didn't burn with danger. They just quietly simmered with confusion. People broke the rules because no one was entirely sure what the rules were. And if someone was supposed to be in charge, well, half the time he was drunk or asleep or chasing a cow that didn't belong to anyone. Sheriffs existed. Some of them were brave, some were bored. A few were barely literate, barely sober, and barely interested in justice. Often, the sheriff was elected by a vote of 30 people, 2 of whom thought they were voting for postmaster. There were no academies, no training, just a tin star and a vague sense that maybe you should keep the peace, though no one defined what peace actually meant. Some sheriffs were respected. Others were tolerated. A few vanished without much explanation, and no one asked too many questions. There weren't really laws in the sense you might expect. They were general expectations based loosely on territory rules, religious norms, and whoever had the most convincing voice. If someone stole a chicken, the punishment might depend on who owned the chicken. If it was Old Man Grady's bird, maybe a stern word and a lecture. If it was the preacher's chicken, it might lead to a night in a makeshift jail, which was usually a room in someone's house, with a locked door and a bored cousin watching it, and even the idea of justice was flexible. A man might get hanged for horse theft in one town and forgiven for it in another, especially if he looked sorry or offered to buy a round at the saloon. If someone got shot, which did happen, though rarely with the flair Hollywood loves, it might be called a crime, or misunderstanding, or self-defense, or just bad luck. Guns were common, but shootouts weren't. People were too tired, mostly. And ammunition cost money. Courtrooms, where they existed, were usually someone's parlor or barn. The judge might be a rancher with good handwriting. The jury might include the defendant's cousin and the storekeep who sold the murder weapon. Trials were short, verdicts were quicker, and appeals, there were none. Once a decision was made, it stuck, even if it didn't make much sense. Which it often didn't. More often than not, disputes were settled through what they called community resolution. That meant arguing in public until someone gave in, or an elder said, enough, or both parties decided they were too tired to keep going. There were no forms. No police reports. Just a lot of muttering and the occasional passive-aggressive. Pie left on someone's porch. Crime, when it happened, wasn't glamorous. Petty theft was the most common. Food, clothes, tools, sometimes livestock, sometimes just firewood. And the response was often equally small, a warning, a punch, a silent agreement not to talk to that person for a while. There were no forensic investigations. If someone left muddy footprints, that was about the extent of the evidence. If a hat was found at the scene, someone might hold it up and say, that looks like Nate's. And if Nate denied it, that was usually the end of it. Violence, when it did flare up, tended to be sloppy and short. Drunken brawls, jealous arguments, property disputes that turned into fistfights, but most people didn't want trouble. They wanted beans to cook evenly, boots that didn't pinch, someone to sit next to at church. Crime was the exception, not the rule, and most of it stemmed from boredom, desperation, or too much whiskey. And speaking of whiskey, saloons were the unofficial centers of law, gossip, and judgment. Arguments were settled there. Deals were made there. Sometimes, justice began and ended with a long drink and a shrug. If someone cheated at cards, you might be thrown out, or you might be punched, or you might win anyway. It was all very flexible. Vigilantes existed, but not in the heroic way you might think. Sometimes they were just neighbors with extra rope and loud opinions. Other times, they were worse than the people they punished. A posse could be called together for a search or a scare, or something more serious. But serious was subjective. And a posse, once riled up, was hard to steer. More than one innocent man was run out of town because someone thought he looked like someone else. That's the thing about justice in the West. It depended on who was looking and what they were afraid of. Even towns with reputations for violence were, on those days, quiet, hot, dull. People walking slowly from one building to another. A dog barking. A door creaking. Maybe a baby crying in the distance. And every so often, Someone would remember that a trial was supposed to happen that afternoon, and the town would half-heartedly gather, not because they cared, but because there wasn't much else to do. What passed for order was mostly inertia. People doing what they'd done yesterday, unless something changed. And if something did change, a new sheriff, a stranger in town, a disagreement over a fence line, then people adjusted, or ignored it, or moved away. There was no grand narrative. Just a lot of quiet days and occasional messes and a general hope that whatever went wrong wouldn't last too long. It wasn't lawless. It was just ... Loosely governed. Like a barn with no walls. The mail came when it felt like it in the West. Time moved slowly, and the mail moved slower. If you wanted to hear from someone, a brother back east, a daughter 3 towns over, a sweetheart you hadn't seen since last planting season, you didn't wait by the window. You didn't count the days. You didn't check the post office because there wasn't one. Not in the sense you're probably thinking. Just a shelf in the general store. Maybe. A sack dropped off by a stagecoach when the roads weren't too muddy, when the horses weren't too tired, when the driver hadn't taken a detour or fallen ill, when everything aligned, which it often didn't. Getting a letter was a small miracle. Not dramatic, just quietly astonishing. It might come after 5 weeks, or 10, or not at all. You check the mail shelf now and then, running your fingers over the stack, hoping to feel your name in the crease of a folded envelope. Sometimes there was nothing. Sometimes there was a piece of someone else's mail, something from a nearby town, misdirected and passed around till someone recognized the name. You might read that letter out loud with the others, even if it wasn't meant for you. News was rare. Any words from the outside world were shared like bread. If you did receive a letter, you read it slowly, often. Every word mattered. Even the spelling mistakes, even the smudged ink. It didn't matter if it was exciting. Usually it wasn't. The hens are still laying. Grandfather's foot is bothering him again. We'd planted peas too early this year. But the words were proof that someone out there still thought of you, that they remembered your name, that they knew you were alive. You'd read it again the next day, and the day after. You might tuck it in your coat pocket, or under your mattress, or fold it into your Bible. The paper would grow soft from handling. The ink would fade from rereading. And sometimes, when you couldn't sleep, you'd whisper the words aloud again, even though you already knew them by heart. Sending mail was a gamble. You had to find paper and ink and the time to sit quietly and form your thoughts. You'd write slowly, carefully, knowing you couldn't waste a page. Most people didn't have envelopes. They'd fold the paper over itself, seal it with wax or a pin. Postage wasn't always exact. Sometimes it was paid on delivery, sometimes ahead of time, sometimes not at all. You'd hand it off to whoever was heading in the right direction. A stage driver, maybe, or a traveling merchant, or a cousin leaving for a neighboring town, and then you hoped that it wouldn't be lost, that it wouldn't get wet, that the person carrying it wouldn't forget or die or change their mind. And, of course, mail couldn't always find you. People moved. Town names changed. Routes were altered. You might receive a letter addressed to a place you no longer lived. One that wandered through post stations for months before landing in the wrong hands. Sometimes, someone would recognize the addressee and walk it over, miles out of their way, just because it felt important. Other times, it would sit in a box behind the store counter until it yellowed, unopened. That's how people missed funerals, weddings, births, news delayed by months. Arrived like ghosts, far too late to react, but too important to ignore. Mail carriers weren't always official. The Pony Express gets talked about, but it barely lasted 2 years. Most letters were carried by whoever was traveling in that direction, and most travelers didn't want to carry too many. It was extra weight, extra worry, so a lot of letters never left, or never arrived, or arrived too late to matter. Sometimes you wrote a letter not expecting a reply, just needing to send it, a thought folded into paper. A piece of yourself, traveling across distance you'd never cross in person. Maybe to a sibling who'd moved east. Maybe to a child who'd gone to California chasing gold. Maybe it's someone who never answered and never would. You write anyway. Because the act of writing made you feel briefly connected, it made the world feel a little less wide. The lack of communication left gaps, big, yawning silences. You didn't know if someone was alive or sick or angry or happy. There was no way to ask a quick question. No easy way to check in. You made peace with not knowing, or you tried to, and you learned to sit with uncertainty like an ache in the side that wouldn't go away but also didn't get worse. Just always there. Rumors sometimes traveled faster than facts. Someone would ride into town and mention a fire in the south, or a war back east, or a preacher who'd gone missing in a mining town. People would nod, shrug, ask vague questions. The truth never arrived, not fully. Just fragments, echoes. You filled in the rest with your own assumptions. And after a while, you stopped asking. Loneliness was a part of life in the West, but not the sharp, dramatic kind. It was a slow, constant hum, like wind against the shutters. A feeling you got when you sat on the porch and realized the last voice you heard was your own 3 hours ago. Letters helped when they came. They reminded you that language still worked, that someone out there still used your name. But most of the time, the mailbox was empty, and you went back to your chores. The mail came when it felt like it. In the West, there is no such thing as reliable mail. Not really. Not in the way you know it now. There are no consistent delivery times, no fixed addresses, no mailboxes, standing proudly at the end of a gravel driveway. More often, the mail system was just a traveling merchant who happened to be heading in the right direction, or a coach that might stop near your town, or a neighbor who promised to pass your letter along to someone passing through Denver. Someday, you might wait 5 weeks for a letter, or 5 months. And you waited not because you had hope, but because there was nothing else to do. You waited because it was all you could do. There was no checking your inbox. There was no, did you get my message? There was only the slow, silent assumption that something might be coming. Or not. If you did receive a letter, it wasn't like now, where they pile up in cheerful bundles of junk and bank statements. A letter was a singular precious event, something you held like a fragile gift, not for its content, but for its arrival. You didn't skim it. You didn't toss it aside. You read it slowly, twice, 3 times, letting your fingers trace the slanted handwriting, letting your eyes rest on the parts that made you feel less alone. It didn't matter if the news was trivial. The hens are molting. Mary's. Truth came out whole. We had rain last Thursday. What mattered was that someone had sat down in a different place on a different day and written your name. They had thought of you long enough to write, long enough to fold and seal, long enough to send this piece of paper across the scrubby, endless distances between you. That in the West was intimacy. That was a lifeline, but often no letter came. Weeks would pass. You'd walk by their general store, where the mail was sometimes kept, a dusty shelf behind the counter, or a wooden box with names written in pencil, half faded by the heat. You'd glance, maybe ask once in a while, "Anything for me?" you'd say. And the clerk would shake his head gently without looking up and say, "Not today." Not today became the soundtrack of your life. Not today, not this week, not this season. Maybe your letter had gotten lost in a stream, soaked and unreadable. Maybe the coach had broken a wheel or been diverted by bandits. Maybe the person meant to write had simply forgotten, or worse, had passed away, somewhere far from where you'd ever find out, and still you'd write, because writing was a kind of quiet hope. You'd sit at a crook table by candlelight, dip your pen in ink. If you had any left, and scratch out a few sentences with your aching hand. The new goat's not milking. We planted early and the frost got most of it. I miss you. And you'd fold the paper carefully, press the edges flat, and hand it off to someone headed east or south or somewhere in the general direction. You never really knew if it would arrive. That wasn't the point. The point was that you had spoken, that you had placed words into the world, and maybe, just maybe, they'd be heard. Sometimes the person you wrote to had moved on, or died, or married, or forgotten you altogether. Letters wandered, sometimes arriving in towns that no longer existed, addressed to people who'd long stopped waiting. There were no forwarding addresses, no return receipts. A letter sent was a letter released, like a bird into a dust storm. You didn't expect to see it again, and when you didn't hear back, you didn't call. You didn't write again, right? Away. You just went on, quietly. The absence became a part of your day, like the chores, like the weather, like the way the floor creaked in the morning. You still thought of them, whoever it was, but you stopped expecting news. That was part of life in the West, too. You had to be comfortable with absence. You had to live with long silences that never resolved. Some letters came late, years late, found at the bottom of a bag, handed off by mistake, tucked into the wrong shelf, discovered by someone looking for sugar. And when they did arrive, they felt like messages from the dead. You'd hold them in your hand and read about things that had already passed. Babies born and now walking, illnesses long since healed, or not. Weddings that happened in a different season, in a town you'll never visit. You'd read it anyway, carefully, slowly, letting the past catch up to you in one folded sheet. The mail didn't come often, and when it did, it didn't bring what you hoped, but still, you checked. You watched the horizon for the dust cloud of a coach. You lingered a little longer near the store counter. You listened for someone calling your name, saying, "This one's for you." Because that moment, that small, uncertain joy, was worth waiting for, even if it never came. Relationships were complicated in the West. People didn't fall in love the way they do in stories. There were no candlelit dinners. No moonlit walks unless you counted stumbling to the outhouse. Romance was quieter, more accidental, less poetic, more logistical. You didn't meet the one, you met whoever was there. Maybe someone 2 farms over. Maybe the teacher who came into town to replace the last one who left after the winter. Nearly froze her lungs. Maybe the widow with the mule that limped. Maybe the boy who delivered flour and always looked a little sunburned. There weren't options. There weren't grand declarations. There were glances exchanged over fence posts. Shared buckets at the well. Silence beside each other on the porch. If something grew, it was slow. And if it didn't, well, you got along anyway, most of the time. Towns were small. People were closer than they wanted to be. You couldn't hide from each other. If someone slammed the door, everyone heard it. If there was an argument, the details reached every ear before supper. You might try to keep your business private, but your business had a way of becoming part of the local folklore, whether you liked it or not. And so relationships grew in strange, stiff ways. You made compromises not out of affection, but necessity. You didn't expect understanding, you hoped for toleration. A kind word at the end of the day meant more than flowers. A partner who mended your torn sleeve without a sigh. That was romance. That was intimacy. Long-distance relationships were even harder. If someone left for gold or land or just to try something else, you didn't know when you'd see them again. You didn't know if you'd see them again. Letters helped when they arrived, which was rare. Mostly, you remembered the last conversation you had and lived inside it. You held on to their handwriting. You imagined their voice reading your words. Some couples stayed together that way, in memory. Others quietly moved on. There was no ceremony, no closure, just silence. And then one day you realized you hadn't thought of them in a while. And that too was part of the rhythm of the West. Living together wasn't easier. You didn't have time for emotional exploration. You had chores. You had fires to stoke, bread to bake, animals to feed, boots to mend, roofs to patch, aches to ignore. Conversations were brief and practical. We're out of flour. The baby's got a cough. Don't let the chickens out until after sunrise. Sometimes you'd sit together at the end of the day, too tired to talk. The silence filled with the buzzing of flies and the soft creak of the wind in the boards. That was connection too, not the thrilling kind, but the worn, working kind that didn't need explaining. Arguments, when they happened, were quiet and heavy. You didn't have the energy to yell. You just went back to your task. Maybe a A little colder, a little sharper in your movements. Disagreements were usually about things like money or fences, or who forgot to cover the beans and let the flies in. You didn't have therapists. You didn't have space. If things got bad enough, someone might sleep in the barn for a night. But usually people just stayed, not because they were happy, but because leaving meant starting over in a world that didn't offer many chances. Friendships were important, but they, too, were defined by proximity. You became close with whoever was nearby. You didn't pick your people. They were assigned by geography. You laughed together sometimes, shared meals, traded stories and borrowed tools, but everyone had their limits. A neighbor might help you mend your fence, but he might also hold a grudge for 20 years because of a pig that wandered too far one spring. Gossip was currency. It filled the space where entertainment should have been. And you learned to speak carefully because everyone was listening. Always children grew up watching all of this. They didn't learn about love from books. They learned it from watching their parents haul water, cook beans, and disagree about how much salt to use. They saw loneliness in the way someone stared into the fire too long. They saw closeness in the way a coat was draped over someone's shoulders without a word. Affection wasn't spoken. It was measured in how long someone waited for you in the cold, or whether they saved you the last biscuit, or if they let you sleep an hour longer when your back hurt. WIDOOD would D was common. So was remarriage. There was no time to mourn deeply. Not for long, anyway. Life pressed forward. Fields needed tending. Children needed feeding. You might miss someone with a quiet daily ache. But eventually, someone else moved into their chair. Maybe not out of love, but out of necessity. Companionship became a kind of survival. You leaned on whoever was close enough to carry some of the weight with you. Love in the West wasn't poetic. It was dusty and stiff and sometimes absent altogether. But now and then, in the stillness, in a hand offered without asking, in a quiet voice saying, I saved you the heel of the bread, in someone waiting up to make sure you got home in the storm, there was something soft, something real. Not beautiful, not cinematic, but present. The weather was your enemy out in the West. You didn't check the weather. The weather checked you. It didn't care if you had plans. It didn't care if your roof leaked, or if the oxen were sick, or if your boots were already soaked. From the last storm, it just came. Dry, wet, scorching, freezing. No warnings, no forecasts, no kind voice on the radio saying what to expect. Just the sky stretching out endlessly above you, with its moods written in clouds you couldn't quite read. You learned to look for small signs. A shift in the wind, a certain heaviness in the air, a sound in the trees. And even then you were usually wrong. The West was good at being unpredictable in the least exciting ways. Summers were long and cruel. Not the romantic kind of summer with lemonade and shade. These were dry summers, with a heat that sat on your shoulders like a yoke and never let go. The sun would rise early and mean, making the cabin feel like a bread oven by noon. There was no air conditioning. No breeze unless you lived near water, which you probably didn't. You'd sweat through your shirt before breakfast and keep sweating long after sundown. Dust stuck to everything, your neck, your lips, the creases behind, your knees. The wooden boards of the house would crack and warp. Tools left outside would burn your hands. The animals got sluggish. The water barrels dried out. And still, there were things to do. You didn't get to wait for a cooler day. You just got up, wiped your forehead, and did it all anyway. Hot, thirsty, dizzy. Then, just when you were used to the heat, winter would arrive like a slap. Not with snowstorms that felt magical or pretty, just cold. Long, gray, bitter cold. The kind that sank in slowly until your fingers stopped bending properly and your teeth ached from breathing. There were mornings when your boots froze where you left them. Nights when you slept in your coat under every blanket you owned and still woke up shivering. Fires helped, but only as long as the woodpile held out. And even then, it was a careful game of rationing. You learned to seal the cracks in the cabin with rags and mud, anything to keep the wind from whistling through your sleep. But it always found a way in. Your ears burned from frostbite. Your nose bled in the dry air. You couldn't do much. Just huddle. Endure. Wait. And between the two extremes, you had dust storms. The kind that rolled across the open plains like something alive. You'd see them in the distance. Dark, tumbling walls of grit, and if you were lucky, you could get inside before it hit. But usually it hit while you were in the middle of something. In the garden. At the well. Fixing a fence post. There wasn't much you could do but duck your head and take it. The dust got everywhere. In your eyes, your teeth, your food. It settled into the pages of your Bible, into the seams of your clothes, into the folds of your skin. It stuck around long after the wind died down, and it made everything taste. Just slightly like dirt. Rain didn't come often. And when it did, it came wrong. Either too little, so light it just teased the crops and vanished, or too much, all at once, soaking the earth until the wagon wheels sank and the rivers turned. Wild and mean. The roads, such as they were, turned to thick soup. You couldn't ride. You couldn't walk without losing a boot. And if you had a cellar, you just hoped it didn't flood. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't change the weather. You just mopped, baled, patched, moved on. Spring, when it came, was less of a season and more of a possibility. A softening of the ground. A few stubborn wildflowers. Maybe a calf born without incident. But even spring was uncertain. A late frost could still wipe out your early planting. A surprise hailstorm could strip the leaves from your orchard in minutes. The West wasn't interested in your plans. It gave and it took away without explanation. There was no escaping it. No real shelter. The roof leaked. The walls groaned. The stove smoked. You learned to live with the discomfort. Not because you were brave, but because there was nothing else to do. You wrapped yourself in whatever you... You kept extra socks near the hearth. You boiled water for warmth, not bathing. You made peace with always being just a little too cold, or a little too hot, or a little too wet. You didn't wait for perfect weather. It didn't exist, and that's what wore you down the most. Not the storms or the floods or the frost, but the constant, low-grade exposure. The sense that the outside world was always pushing in. Through the chinks in the wall, through the cracks in your boots, through the wind that slipped under the door at night. You were never quite comfortable, and over time, you stopped expecting. To be money rarely meant comfort if you ever find yourself wishing you lived in the Wild West because you think you could have struck it rich. Let's gently lay that idea to rest. Not with a bang, just a soft sigh and a long, uncomfortable silence. Because while money existed, why East coins, paper, sometimes gold dust in a little pouch tucked in a coat, they rarely brought comfort. The kind of wealth that changed lives was almost entirely fictional. Most people didn't chase treasure. They chased survival. And often, they didn't catch that either. Let's begin with the basics. $1 back then might sound like it went far. In some ways, it did. A pound of flour, a plug of tobacco, a dozen nails. Sure, you could buy those things. Sometimes, if the general store was stocked and the road hadn't washed out. But what that dollar didn't buy was safety. Or peace, or a new wagon wheel when you're splintered 3 days out from the nearest town. Most folks didn't have much coin on hand, and what they did have was usually promised to something else. A debt, a crop, a neighbor who loaned them sugar last winter. It wasn't that you didn't want to save. It's just that every single thing you owned was either falling apart, wearing out, or needed replacing. And you could only fix so much with a hammer and hope. Work didn't exactly pay well. You might break your back for weeks hauling lumber or digging post holes and come away with just enough money to buy beans, soap, and a pair of socks if the socks were on sale. Teachers were paid in chickens or bread. Store clerks lived above the shop, not because it was charming, but because it was all they could afford. If you were lucky enough to be a blacksmith or run a halfway decent saloon, you might earn a steady bit of coin, but that coin usually vanished as soon as it arrived. into tools, repairs, whiskey taxes, bandages, and the quiet expense of keeping things going another week. There were gold rushes. Yes. Whole caravans of hopeful people chasing dreams into California or Colorado or wherever someone had recently found a shiny rock in a riverbed. But gold wasn't magic. It was heavy, dirty, dangerous to find, and even more dangerous to keep. Most of the people who actually made money from gold weren't miners. They were the ones selling shovels, tents, and boot grease to the desperate crowds who didn't know they were walking into a slow, expensive disappointment. For every one person who found a nugget worth shouting about, there were 1,000 who just found blisters, cold beans, and regret. And even if you did have money, it didn't guarantee much. There weren't many stores, and the ones that existed might only carry what they could get from the last shipment, which might have been 3 months ago. If the wagon didn't tip or the driver didn't catch fever, you could walk in with your pocket full of coins and still leave empty-handed because there was simply nothing to buy. A new coat not in stock. Good boots? Maybe next season. Flour that didn't smell slightly of mouse droppings. Sold out last week. Money, in that sense, was theoretical. It gave you access to goods that might exist. But more often, it bought you a place in line, a promise, or a sigh from behind the counter. Repair work was constant and rarely affordable. You didn't call a handyman. You were the handyman. Or you begged your neighbor who had slightly better tools and slightly worse. Manners. When things broke, and they always broke, you learned to patch, wedge, shim, nail, or wrap. Your roof leaked. Put a pan under it. Your lantern cracked. Use string to hold it together. Your only saddle tore at the seam. Fold a blanket under it and hope your horse didn't mind. You didn't buy replacements unless you absolutely had to. You made do. Often for years, debt was everywhere. It wasn't written up in neat contracts with clear repayment schedules. It was woven into every interaction, favors, trades, unspoken expectations. You owed someone a favor because they helped dig your well last spring. They owed you a rabbit because you lent them your axe when theirs broke. Money was just one part of a larger economy of dependence and compromise. And sometimes it turned sour. People didn't forget a debt. Even if they never mentioned it again, they remembered. You could feel it in how long they took to wave back, or how cold their voice was when you came asking for help. Then there were the truly strange economics of survival. A man might sell his best rifle for enough money to buy food for his children, and then go hungry the next time coyotes came. For the chickens, a woman might trade her last piece of decent jewelry for medicine that didn't work. People sold things they needed because they needed something else slightly more. The balance was always shifting. Comfort wasn't something you purchased. It was something you occasionally stumbled into by accident. And even then, it didn't last long. Even the wealthier townsfolk, the banker, the store owner, the land surveyor lived with a kind of cautious discomfort. There were no luxury vacations, no spas, no fresh fruit unless you grew it yourself and beat the birds to it. You might own more, but you still woke up cold in winter. You still heard the mice scratching in the walls. You still worried about the next storm, the next drought, the next time your horse limped and wouldn't recover. Money gave you margin, perhaps, but not ease. So much of the West was about labor. Slow, aching, repetitive labor, and no amount of money could buy you out of that. The fence still needed mending. The stove still needed feeding. The mud still needed scraping off your boots every night. The dollars in your pocket, if you had any, didn't make your bed softer or your biscuits fluffier or your back hurt less. At best, they gave you a few moments of relief. A better bar of soap. A cup of coffee that didn't taste like burnt beans. A pair of gloves that lasted 2 weeks instead of one. And then it was gone. Towns were smaller than you think when you hear the word town in the context of the Wild West. Your brain probably conjures up a wide street, maybe a saloon on the corner, someone sweeping the porch with their hat pulled low, a few horses tied up in front of a general store. Maybe there's a sheriff leaning in a doorway, a piano playing something cheerful through a window, but that's a storybook. A quiet lie we've told ourselves to make the past seem orderly. Even a little charming, The truth? Most towns weren't much of anything. Just a cluster of buildings that hadn't blown away yet, all leaning slightly in the same direction, as if even the architecture was tired of trying. A western town was more of a suggestion than a destination. It might start with one thing. A post office, a tavern built out of scrap wood by someone who couldn't stand drinking alone anymore. Then maybe a store would follow, a church, a stable if you were lucky. No sidewalks, no plan, just buildings wherever someone felt like hammering planks together. Most weren't incorporated, mapped, or even named until long after they existed. They were born out of necessity, not ambition. Settlers didn't come looking for civilization. They came looking for a place to stop walking. The average town might have 50 people. 100 if it was near water or along a railroad line. That's not enough for privacy. Not nearly. Everyone knew where you lived. They knew who was sick, who hadn't paid for their cornmeal last week, and who was feuding with the blacksmith. You didn't need a newspaper. The gossip moved faster than print ever could. A sigh at the general store could become a scandal by sunset. And in a place where everyone relied on each other for just about everything, that wasn't always. Charming, it was suffocating. You didn't have neighbors. You had witnesses. Towns were dusty in the summer, muddy in the spring, frozen in the winter, and never quite clean. Boardwalks, if they existed at all, were warped and splintered. You'd catch a nail in your boot just trying to buy a spool of thread. There were outhouses behind every building, most of them leaning, and the flies made no distinction between businesses and homes. Trash piled up where it could, usually in the alley behind the saloon, where the wind would scatter it helpfully. Across Main Street, chickens roamed freely. Dogs barked at everything. Horses left reminders of their passage, and nobody had the energy to scrape the road clean. The general store was the heart of it all, and not in a romantic way. It wasn't a cheerful place. It was a place where you stood in line for lamp oil or tobacco or a sack of beans and made awkward conversation with people you'd known your whole life and still didn't really like. You didn't shop. You asked quietly if something had come in yet. The nails you ordered 2 months ago. The winter coat your son had outgrown. The coffee your wife missed so much it made her cry. The shopkeeper would nod vaguely and say maybe next week, even though he didn't believe it either. Everything was late. Everything was almost out of stock. Everything smelled like dried apples and dust. There might be one saloon. It was never quite as lively as you're imagining. Maybe there was a piano. More often, there wasn't, just a few chairs that wobbled, a bar that had been wiped down with the same rag since last spring, and beer that was warm and sour. The mirror behind the bar was usually cracked. The bartender had heard every story twice. There weren't gamblers with flashy vests, just tired men nursing their fourth drink before walking home to a house that smelled like burnt lard and disappointment. Sometimes there were fights, but mostly there was silence. Drunken, slumped silence. People drank not for fun, but for dullness, for forgetting, for making the dust in their mouth taste like something else for just a little while. Law enforcement, if it existed, was more of a formality. The sheriff might be someone's cousin, might run the feed store on the side, might forget to lock the jail or use it as a storage shed. Crime wasn't what people think. No dramatic shootouts or horse chases, just petty theft. Disputes over fences. Someone accusing someone else of stealing a pig or a chicken or a look at their wife. Arguments bloomed into feuds, and feuds became habits. And no one really knew what to do about it except avoid each other and talk behind closed doors. Church was a social obligation. Not because everyone was especially pious, but because there wasn't anything else to do. Sunday morning was when you dressed in your least-stained shirt and sat quietly on a wooden bench for an hour, listening. To someone read scripture with one eye on the window in case it started to rain. Afterward, you might stay for stew or pie, or just to eavesdrop on someone else's misfortune. It was something to break up the week, something to mark the passage of time in a place where the calendar barely seemed to matter. Children didn't have playgrounds. If there was a school, it was one room, one teacher, all ages, with desks carved up by generations of bored little hands. Lessons were short and inconsistent. Learning depended more on weather, livestock, and illness than ambition. And the rest of the time, kids worked, gathering eggs, hauling water, watching their siblings. Nobody romanticized it. It was just the way things were taught, and always in the background, the slow erosion of optimism. The feeling that this town, this sad little speck on a map, wasn't really growing. It was just existing, trying not to fall apart faster than people could fix it. New families didn't move in often. When they did, it was the talk of the year. More often, people drifted away, their cabins left empty, their gardens turning to weeds. You'd see a wagon leaving and just nod. Maybe you envied them. Maybe you hoped they'd right. But they never did. You wouldn't last a day if you've made it this far, through the beans and blisters, through the outhouses and aching teeth, through the long days of walking behind stubborn oxen and the longer nights, spent listening to wind scratch the sides of a thin-walled cabin. You already know the answer. Not the one you say out loud when you're romanticizing the past over coffee and comfort, the real answer. The one that settles in your bones like cold morning air. You wouldn't have lasted a day. And that's not an insult. It's not a challenge either. It's just the honest, creaking truth of it all. The Wild West, for most people, was not wild, not free, and not especially fun. It was tedious, grim, repetitive. You did the same chores every day, in the same clothes, with the same cracked hands, surrounded by the same tired people who, just like you, were hoping the roof held through another winter and that the coffee didn't run out before the wagon arrived. There was no soundtrack, no glory, just the dull thud of boots on packed dirt, and the sound of your own breath as you hauled water uphill again. From the moment you opened your eyes, if you even slept, the work began. No soft alarm clock, no shower, just stiff limbs, sore joints, and the long ritual of dragging on, half dry. Clothes in the half dark while the wind knocked around outside and something howled that might have been a dog or might have been your stomach. There were no weekends, no breaks, no such thing as a quick errand. Even a trip to fetch eggs meant lifting something, scraping something, stepping over something, and maybe dealing with a goat that had opinions about you. Food didn't comfort you. It just stopped you from passing out. If you had beans, you ate beans. If you didn't, you looked for whatever was closest to edible and hoped it didn't taste too much like dust or desperation. Cooking was slow, and cleaning up even slower. Every bite was the result of effort. Grinding, chopping, boiling, reheating, and once you ate it, you were still hungry. Not because there wasn't enough, though sometimes there wasn't, but because your body never quite caught up with the demands of the day. Your body, in fact, would have been your first enemy. No one got enough sleep. No one had the right shoes. No one's spine was particularly pleased with how they lived. Your hands cracked in winter and your feet blistered in summer and your back never stopped complaining, though the language it used got more creative as the years dragged on. If you got sick and you waited it out in a cold bed with a warm cloth and a prayer, sometimes you got better, sometimes you didn't. Medicine was mostly a theory, and pain was something people didn't talk about because they didn't have time to. The landscape didn't care how much you dreamed of it. It was not your friend. It wasn't even particularly impressed that you showed up. Whether you lived in the hills or on the plains, the environment was mostly a reminder that you weren't in charge. Rain came too hard or not at all. Dust blew into your mouth, your eyes, your dinner. Roads vanished without warning, and maps were often just guesses made permanent. The sun could roast you. The snow could break your wagon wheels. The wind could howl so long and so loud that you began to understand why some people just walked into it and didn't come back. There were people, of course, other settlers, ranchers, shopkeepers, travelers, drunks, pastors, children with serious eyes, and women with tired hands. They weren't characters in a story. They were real and often unpleasant. Not out of malice, just exhaustion. Just the slow erosion of charm that happens when life is a series of chores and choices you never really wanted to make. Friendships existed, yes, but they were practical, functional. A friend was someone who helped mend your roof, not someone you told your secrets to. Most of the time, you kept those to yourself, or wrote them in a letter that might never be delivered. Romance, such as it was, rarely sparkled. It was built on proximity, shared labor, and a mutual agreement not to freeze to death alone. You didn't fall in love over candlelight. You fell into a kind of partnership, patched together with borrowed time and daily endurance. You argued about firewood. You made peace over biscuits. You held each other through coughing fits and kept going because you had to. There wasn't time to dream of anything else. You were too busy surviving each small, uncomfortable hour. And through it all, through the labor, the loneliness, the smell of your own sweat and everyone else's, you lived in a kind of constant background ache. The ache of effort, of disappointment, of watching things break faster than you could fix them. The Wild West was not designed to make you happy. It was a place of tension, between dryness and flood, between scarcity and just enough, between wanting to leave and knowing you couldn't. There was always something unfinished. A fence that needed mending, a roof that needed patching, a horse that needed shoeing or selling or burying. You couldn't just take a break. There weren't any. You couldn't take a long bath. The water was cold or scarce or dirty. You couldn't just run to the store for medicine. You couldn't book a doctor's appointment. You couldn't call a friend or check the weather or take a walk to clear your head unless you wanted to risk a twisted ankle and a rattlesnake. Everything was slow. Everything was work. Even the small pleasures, a clean shirt, a ripe apple, a letter from home, came with effort, patience, and a little bit of luck. So, yes, you wouldn't have lasted a day. Not because you're weak, but because we're not made for it anymore. We weren't raised to live in rooms without clocks, to cook with firewood, to go months without a real conversation, or to chase. After a runaway mule with a twisted knee and no breakfast in our stomach. The people who did last weren't braver or stronger. They were just there, and they kept being there. Day after slow, dusty, splinter-filled day dot, so now, with all the facts laid bare like a weather-beaten floorboard. The next time you watch a movie set in the Old West, when the music swells and the hero rides into town, just remember, the real West didn't have a soundtrack. It had blisters and burnt beans and badly fitting boots dot, and the only thing that came fast was the sunset dot. So tonight, as you lay in a clean bed with soft pillows and running water, and no one asking you to churn butter at dawn, dot, dot, just be quietly grateful. You were born too late to live in the Wild West, dot, because really, dot, you wouldn't have lasted a day. And that's perfectly peacefully fine. Sleep well, traveler. There's no dust here.